Salish, a couple others. They're cool.
Yeah, totally.
Oh, hey, Carrie's here.
All right.
Here, I'll look.
I've been listening a lot to Fawnwood lately.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna move Carrie over to panelist, just so we don't have to do that later in the call. Yeah. Hey, Carrie, you're welcome to keep your video off until we have our conversation between the steering committee and Dr. Whye, if you want.
Definitely leaving it off. Thank you.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Oh,
live to Facebook.
Okay, I will start that right now. We're still waiting on Dr. Whye, so we will clearly wait for him to get started since he's our featured guest. Feel free to go refill your coffee or tea or whatever you're doing, and we'll get started as soon as Dr. Whye gets here.
Yeah, early bio break. And also, please feel free to introduce yourself and the ancestral territory that you're currently residing on.
And then let's all be monitoring our inboxes just in case Dr. Whye is having any issues.
Okay.
Oh, hey, Sarah's here. Cool.
Hi, Sarah.
Michael, yes, it's going to be live streamed to Facebook. It will also be posted on our YouTube page in a couple days. Oh, hey, Helania. What is the... Hey, Dr. Whye. We're so glad you could join us. How are you doing?
Good to see you all. I'm glad to join you all too. Can I just take a quick moment to fix a technical thing?
Go for it.
Okay.
Okay, I just want to say that was hilarious. Caitlin and Cody took a drink at the same time and then also made a face because it was hot. It was
It's still kind of burning my esophagus a little bit.
I just made it mine too. So.
Yeah, we planned that out. Yeah, that was very strategic. That's like a necessity for me now. I need like a hot beverage for all Zoom calls because like it's just like a needed little reward to like have to be on my computer all day. I drink a lot of different teas. Well, we have a wide geographical range in the call today. That's really cool. Thank you all for being here.
Looking at that.
Okay, I'm back.
Awesome. All right, well, we are successfully streaming on Facebook. So I'll pop back up on video when we have our conversation with the steering committee a little bit later in the call, but I'm going to let Evie and Cody introduce you here today. So I'll see you in a little bit.
Okay, great.
We'll probably just wait a couple of minutes and then get started.
Be good. I'm just, yep, that works for me.
Okay, great.
And do I have a capacity to screen share? I do. Great.
just want to check in with everybody before we start. Is there anything else that we can provide, Dr. White, or?
I think I'm in good shape. Thank you, though.
Yeah, all right. So if Cody is ready, we'll go ahead and start. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the fourth session of the Food Sovereignty Speaker Series. We're very excited to host today's panel. Devote los Inchim Aniabo. My name is Evie Ferreira. I'm from Tucson, Arizona, and my grandparents are from Naco, Imoris, and Hermosillo, Sonora, Mexico, and Phoenix, Arizona. My family ancestry is of Yome, Mexicana, and Portuguese. I'm a recent graduate from Humboldt State University, and I'm also a proud member of the HSU Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace. I majored in Native American Studies and Environmental Studies with a minor in Ethnic Literature. We want to thank you all so much for joining us today. This will be the fifth speaker series hosted by Humboldt State University Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace. And with your enthusiasm and support, the first of many speaker series. Today, it's an honor to speak with Dr. Kyle Whye. I will be moderating with Cody, friend and peer committee member. Cody?
Yakalidu, Cody Henriksen Ilan Shida, Lydia Enseleski Shunkda Nilan, Fedora Kwasnikov Shunk Tinkda Nilan, Denina Usukpia Gilan Shida, Shikoya Hidi Ninang Chikilan. Hello everyone, my name is Cody Henriksen and I'm an enrolled member of the Ninilchik village tribe and of Denina and Sugpiaq descent. I'm also Russian, Norwegian, and Danish. I was born and raised in my tribe's traditional territory in Alaska and currently live here in Arcata, where I'm an undergraduate at HSU, studying marine biology and Native American studies. I'm also a proud member of HSU's Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace, and I work as an intern for Save California Salmon. I'm also now an academic advisor for the planning commission of my tribe's Heritage Center. And now, before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that Humboldt State University's occupation of unceded Whye territory. This territory includes the Whye tribe, Bear River Rancheria, and Blue Lake Rancheria. HSU is located in Arcata, known as Gudini, meaning over in the woods or among the redwoods. Whye peoples continue to remain in relationship to these lands through ceremony, culture, stewardship. They are important parts not only of the history of this area, but also in the continuing knowledge of this place. And as numerous Indigenous scholars have articulated, land acknowledgements are the beginning, not an end. For land acknowledgements to be meaningful, they need to be accompanied with action. And today, our call of action for all of you is to donate to the Humboldt State University's Lab and Cultural Workspace. And we will paste a link in the chat for you here. Today, we will first hear from Dr. Whye and then welcome questions from attendees before the Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace Committee join the panel for a discussion about the future of HSU's Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace. If you have any questions for Dr. Kyle Whye, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will also be live on Facebook where you can submit any questions in the comments. Please enjoy the final speaker discussion, and Evie will now let us know of today's topic, and I'll pass the mic. I think you're muted, Evie.
Perfect. Thank you, Cody. The title of our panel discussion today is Indigenous Food Sovereignty and the Timing of Climate Change with Dr. Kyle Whye. This presentation will discuss Dr. Whye's most recent publication titled Too Late for Indigenous Climate Justice, Ecological and Relational Tipping Points, in conjunction with relevant cases for advancing Indigenous food sovereignty. People in the Indigenous climate justice movement agree on the urgency of action to stop dangerous climate change. However, the qualities of relationships connecting Indigenous peoples with other societies, governments, non-governmental organizations, and corporations are not conducive to coordinated action that would avoid further injustice against Indigenous peoples in the process of responding to climate change. I would like to briefly present Dr. Kyle Whye. Kyle Whye is a professor of environment and sustainability and George Willis Pack professor at the University of Michigan. Kyle Whye Kyle's research addresses moral and political issues concerning climate policy and Indigenous peoples, the ethics of cooperative relationships between Indigenous peoples and science organizations, and problems of Indigenous justice in public and academic discussions of food sovereignty, environmental justice, and the Anthropocene. He is an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Kyle Whye. Please tell us more about yourself. Thank you.
Bonjour, everyone, and I appreciate Evie and Cody's introductions and the chance to share with this community. I was excited to hear from Caitlin Reed about the Food Sovereignty Initiative at Humboldt State and the way in which the program's being set up to support Indigenous peoples and our priorities and the relationships that matter to us. And so I was hoping to be short in my remarks and the presentation so that we could actually move into the discussion and questions, given there's so many different overlapping areas that I know we can do good to have a chance to talk about together regarding connections between foods, Indigenous foods, climate change, climate justice. And so I'm going to present some ideas from the paper Too Late for Climate Justice, but I'm going to combine it with some newer ideas that I've been working on and make some connections to climate change and food, but then leave there to be further time to further go into these connections and relationships. So I'm just going to do a screen share. Okay. So a few things, I've been working in the space of climate change for some time, and I've published on food, Indigenous food, but I came through that topic through the work I was doing on climate change. And this is from the last National Climate Assessment, the tribal chapter that I was an author on, and it's a map that shows all the different Indigenous peoples' planning initiatives on climate change, just in the U.S. context, and it actually doesn't include a lot of the organizing against dirty energy, so it's not even comprehensive on climate change, right? But despite that, it originally had about 800 examples of actions Native folks were taking on climate change, and now it's much larger. I think it's well over 1,000, and it's hosted on a website from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You can find it in the tribal chapter and Indigenous chapter in the 4th National Climate Assessment. But one of the things in all these initiatives that I noticed was very different from other types of climate change initiatives was that for Native folks, climate change was all about food. And so I would challenge anybody to find me an example of how Native folks are addressing climate change where food is not sort of a key topic. And so, in the 4th National Climate Assessment, in the Tribes and Indigenous Peoples chapter, food is a big part of what's at risk regarding climate change, but also organizing, mobilizing around food, first foods, or foods that are grown and produced in the way that reflect our values as Indigenous people. That's part of the solution, actually, to climate change in 1,000 different ways, and we can discuss that obviously later. Now, one of the things that's been happening in my work on climate change is, as a lot of you all know, there is this idea that the dominant societies around us, that they're just not taking, climate change seriously enough. They don't really see it as an urgent problem. And so it's like, how do you get these folks to get motivated to do something about climate change, given that they've just been sitting back and accepting their privileges and their carbon intensive lifestyles? But what I found is that way of thinking about it betrays something that's happening right now, is that as Indigenous people, we should also be concerned about what happens when the dominant societies around us, when they do take climate change seriously. And so, if you go to that paper, I cite some of the literature, there's even more literature that talks about how when people are pursuing solutions to climate change, whether it's hydropower, solar, wind, whether it's certain types of forest conservation, or even, I wouldn't call it a solution, but even these cases of geoengineering where people try to use technologies to slow down trends of warming to buy more time. But if you look at all these solutions, a lot of them, as the literature is being the show, as well as numerous indigenous testimonies, are pretty bad for us. I mean, the fact that hydropower is returning as a solution to climate change when that's been one of the most harmful technologies to indigenous people, leading to displacement and a number of economic issues and environmental degradation of indigenous territories. And when you look at the other ones, right, like wind and solar and so on, and they can be harmful to land. They can be organized in ways where indigenous people aren't leaders in the energy transition. Oftentimes their supplies and implements come from unethical practices. And so when you look at all of these solutions, and again, I won't go into too much detail here for this presentation, we can also talk about more in the discussion. In some ways, they make us wonder, about what the future would be like in a lower carbon footprint world. It could actually be one that for many Native folks, because they were displaced or because they remain dependent on dominant societies for energy, that, is that really a future that we want, that reflects our values? And so in this way, it makes us wonder that, if the members of the dominant society, they actually do get more serious about, climate change, that seriousness or that urgency by itself is not necessarily good for us. And so we really need to shift our attention as well to protecting ourselves against the solutions to climate change. And given what I was saying earlier about that connection to climate change and food, I've found that a number of solutions to climate change, including a lot of forest conservation ones, pose threats to indigenous foods that are already facing threats due to climate change trends. And so recently I was part of this project with the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians that reviewed a congressional action plan on climate change that the House of Representatives had produced fairly recently this year. And you can find this online on ATNI's climate change page. But what we found when we went over it, right, is that, what was lacking from an indigenous perspective, and this is just my opinion on it, right, what was lacking from an indigenous perspective was that the discussion in this plan of the energy transition, need to go back to those basics of like tribal consultation and relationship building and trust, and actually ensuring that tribal sovereignty matters. These aren't topics related to the physics of climate change. These are relationship building topics. And why is it that after all these years of colonialism and all this tremendous scholarship and testimony from indigenous leaders and scholars and so on, that have actually talked about the importance of relationships, diplomatic relationships, social relationships, that while we're facing this climate change crisis, that we're still having to point this out. And so, this has led me to really try to pick up on the work that many scholars in Indigenous studies have done to understand actually relationships and how certain types of urgency to address crises like climate change can actually be pretty bad for us if folks are not attending to the relationships that really matter in terms of creating a coordinated response to climate change and its implications on food and food systems, including those that matter to us most as Indigenous people. And so I've been thinking about kinship and trying to really get some more details about what kinship means. And so what I've been wanting to argue is that this type of urgency that I was describing that people have to climate change, an urgency that sometimes pushes them to promote solutions that are harmful to Indigenous people and other groups too, is that the problem there is they're not paying attention to kinship. They're not paying attention to the current state of kinship. And so I want to begin to sort of combine this with this idea that for many Native folks, food sovereignty is about restoring, strengthening, establishing kinship with food. And I think there's absolutely a relationship here. And so, building on the work that many others have done before, I think kinship is actually a particular way of thinking about our relationships with other people. It's not the only way. It exists with a number of other different ways of thinking about our relationships, but kinship is a very particular way, and it's actually something that's lacking, in a context like the United States. So when you say you have a kinship relation, it's not just like a biological relationship. It's a relationship, that you might have with your family, but you can have with a lot of other folks in different spheres of your life. So any kinship relationship is a relationship that even if it's experienced as interpersonal or with you and a food or an animal or plant or species, right? It's a relationship that that when you take it seriously, when you have it, when you maintain it, you support it, you dedicate yourself to it, that it's not just one that is limited to an impact on just you and the other being or entity that you have the relationship with, but it's actually a relation that in itself represents a large social and support network that you have. It's a relationship that when you invest your time in it, it actually speaks to the larger community that you're part of, and the way that that community can support your goals, your values, your freedom, and that makes it possible for there to be a community that can respond to even the most challenging changes. So if you have a lot of kinship in a community, right, it means that there's actually high levels of consent, trust, and responsibility, or reciprocity. So a lot of times Indigenous people talk about kinship in terms of having responsibilities across different members of a society, human and non-human. And that's just the tip, right? The responsibility is just the tip. The responsibilities matter when they're consensual, they're trustworthy, and they're reciprocal, and there are other qualities too. So responsibility is just a type of relationship I have, but what makes the relationship really matter is if it's carried out through traditions that respect and honor consent, trust, reciprocity, and other qualities. So these are the qualities that must attach to a responsibility for it to truly be kinship. And so in this way, those examples of urgency that I mentioned earlier, they're not respecting kinship because somebody is so overexcited about certain solutions that they're not actually paying attention to whether the current social relationships are set up in ways where there's consent, there's trust, and reciprocity. As Native people, we don't trust the green energy industry to respect us in the energy transition because very few dominant energy industries or energy industries from dominant societies or funded by them have done so in the past. We understand, and we've seen this in some of the US government's various plans, that do they respect our consent? We're hardly even referenced in those plans. Are they reciprocal? Are they ones that are going to create equal or more appropriate economic and other incentives for us to participate? And so we're already in a world where these kinship qualities are not respected. And so to expect that a shift toward a solution is itself, through a technology, going to change, repair, or establish these qualities is one that is actually a bit surprising that people wouldn't be attentive to. And so folks talk about the importance of mobilizing technologies to stop a ecological tipping point, right? How do green energy technologies stop us from, getting too much warming? But they actually don't oftentimes attend to the fact that for Native folks, you can't talk about ecology separate from society, and that there's actually a relational tipping point, a kinship tipping point, that actually refers to histories of systems of kinship that made societies more adaptable to change. I guarantee you a society that has high levels and traditions of consent, trust, and reciprocity is going to mobilize in ways that are just and ethical to adapt to crisis. And so that takes time to develop, right? That type of kinship, it can take generations to develop, right? Because it requires ceremony and traditions and, years of political accountability and other social institutions that have to build over time. And so that's also a system, right? And that system has a tipping point too. And the relational tipping point can get so over-energized and disrupted that itself means that it's going to be more challenging for us to respond to crises. And what folks that get too involved with the urgency, where they forget the fact that their solutions can be extremely harmful, are ones that I've actually forgotten that there is a relational or a kinship tipping point as well. and that tipping point due to colonialism, it's probably passed a long time ago, right? And the fact that it probably did pass a long time ago, at least in a global sense, suggests that it's shocking. Actually, that's what people should be urgent about. People should be urgent about the passing of the relational tipping point, the kinship tipping point, and that should frame how they understand the so-called ecological tipping point that's threatened by climate change. And the few things I wanted to show you all before I just close is that I actually think that this is a function of how people tell stories and how people narrate climate change, through their assumptions about time. I mean, I wanted to talk about a few of those assumptions, and for me, this is important for kind of understanding, not only climate change, right, but what food sovereignty is and how we measure progress within food sovereignty. Because when we engage in the protection of our food, say in relation to climate change, or we're simply engaging in our food ways or rekindling our food ways, how do we measure the goals? Like, what are we, what are we doing? Where are we drawing wisdom from? How are we understanding what's possible in the future? And to use kind of a term I don't like, how are we measuring like our success, in our food work? And I think that's actually quite related to these issues of climate change, right? Because how do we measure our progress in relation to addressing climate change? Do we measure it in terms of whether we have the technologies to lower carbon footprint? Or do we measure it in terms of, are we taking measures right now to improve kinship, so when the energy transition emerges, the kinship will make it possible for us to have a better future, and not just one that assumes that the status quo is at risk, a status quo which is not good for Native folks and other communities that are especially vulnerable to climate change. And so what I've noticed is that urgency is oftentimes something that's come about when people only think about climate change in terms of a ticking clock, in terms of a linear time. And people think about food systems like this too, that there was a particular way a food system was, and it's either declined or maintained or increased over time. And so, do we have enough time to restore a particular food, or is time running out? And when people think about the ticking clock and think about time in linear ways, it sometimes gives rise to that sense that we need to pursue solutions over and against our what I would argue is our real sense of urgency about kinship. And so I've thought about some different ways of telling time, whether it's depth or memorial time or seasonal time, or even a time I call kinship or dystopian time. And then there's some amazing interlocutors in Indigenous studies, and name a few, Mark Rifkin and Grace Dillon, Zoe Todd and Heather Davis, and more. I mean, these are folks that work in the environmental area, and some of these films you can find on YouTube as well. The Sixth World, Awakening. These are all things you can check out. They're all meditations on time and rigorous accounts of thinking about Indigenous time as it relates to kinship. And so one of the things that I noticed, right, is first thinking about climate change. So many folks were caught up in the idea that climate change is just this sort of like unprecedented thing. And a lot of non-native folks talk about foods in this way, right? Like that if a particular food is threatened and they find out about it, that's unprecedented, right? But whereas we know that our food systems over time have been, destroyed cyclically, and that we occupy a particular point in that time period where our responsibilities are centered, and there's a current state of kinship for those times. And so one of the things I've tried to draw out, right, is if you think about an Indigenous perspective on things, if the red is like 1,000 years, our history is like, thousands of years, right? It's huge. And we know that in the green, right, there's been disruptive periods in the past, and many of our stories are about those disruptive periods. And notice that when we actually think about stories, say, that are related to climate change or related to foods, do any of the stories actually say that a challenge or disruption that happened to our ancestors, that it was one in which some technology saved the day? I don't really know that many that say that. It's usually about the fact that the reason for the problem in the first place was a breakdown in kinship. And so the lessons are a restoration of kinship, which is why so many stories focus on the importance of responsibilities. And for us, that's not just a simple concept. It's one that speaks to years of wisdom and thinking about disruptions going back thousands of years. And so in this way, right, US settlement is just this one disruption. There's been disruptions before of different kinds. We're in this one that is a small part of our history. And so we're bringing that wisdom to be able to weigh in on what we need to do. And that's why so much Indigenous guidance is about kinship. So here, right, to look at the same model in a different way, like when I was in educational system in the US, right, everything was about the last 200 years when the US was formed, right, the industrial period, the origin of the United States. And you didn't get a lot about the several thousand. They just treated it like something that happened before, and you got very little information, maybe something about the Greeks, and it's just kind of random, right, in our educational system. And I remember they're concerned with the perpetuation of US industrial culture. And that's what's threatened by climate change. And that's why there's that sense of urgency, that kind of linear time. But then for an Indigenous approach, it's a little bit different. We know there was climate change in the past. We know sometimes humans were to blame in different ways, right? And we're not trying to protect the last 200 years of industrial society. That's not been great for us. That's not normal to us. And so why do we want to go back to it or protect it or foster it? We're actually trying to move ahead into something different and better, and building on, again, that wisdom I was talking about. And so we know with these little arrows that it's been complex and there's been lots of change and so on over time. We don't need to privilege the present in some way to the point where it makes it urgent and we forget our kinship responsibilities. And so these are histories of the growth or decline of kinship systems that we know have gone on, for generations and decades. And so this is why in previous work I've referred to the fact that actually we recognize that we're already in the dystopia, whereas for oftentimes the settler society, at least in the United States, right, they're in the time of their that their ancestors fantasized, right, their ancestors that didn't think they could conquer or dominate or whatever it was, Indigenous people, they would have fantasized about the situation today. And so that fantasy is at risk for them. Whereas for us, we're in the dystopia already, and we're trying to build ourselves out of the dystopia. And so it's a very different narrative. But I think that's why food sovereignty is important, because Indigenous foods and first foods, they're like hubs for they're hubs for our memories and our kinship, and they can actually energize kinship relationships and the building of kinship in ways that other things actually can't, right? So that's part of what's important, is that actually food sovereignty is about the value that food brings as a generator of kinship, and we don't actually have that many things that can do that, and that's why food has an important place. Another way I've been thinking about time is, in discussions about food sovereignty and climate change, a lot of times focus on like Indigenous knowledge about, seasonal lifestyles and seasonal foods and so on. So this idea that, different seasons, you do different things. And again, I wanted to point out something that I've really learned when I thought about this a lot, is that it's not just that, you do certain activities to take care of certain foods or prepare for climate change, and they're changing during the seasons. I mean, I've talked to so many different amazing elders and harvesters and others that are out there on the land. And when I've engaged in this work, these activities myself in collaboration with others, I've really thought about, well, what are we talking about when we talk about seasonal time? And so one of the things that I've found in talking about seasonal time is it's actually not that much about the seasons, is that people don't really talk about, this month or that month, or this calendar, but what they actually talk about is something a little bit different. So there's the cues and changes that happen in the environment. So imagine living in a way where there's no clock, but actually you're just measuring time according to things that pop up and things that go away throughout the year. So thinking about Indigenous foods and how they change and transition and so on throughout the year. But then when people describe that, like they don't really say, oh, during this month, this food emerges. they actually usually talk about how the changes throughout the year are ones where people's coordinated social activities are changing, right? This time of the year, you go fishing. Well, you don't do that by yourself. You do that with others. At this time, you protect these habitats so that something grows or is available another time. That's a collective activity, or people talk about ceremonies. So very rarely would somebody just talk about a linear time conception of the seasons. And it's never really cause and effect. It's just all about how different social activities are occurring throughout the year to take care of these relatives that become foods and medicines and so on. And so seasonal time, right, it's actually not just I measure time according to what pops up and what goes away, but actually it's living according to constant shifting coordinated activities across our societies. And what do you know? Right, these coordinated activities are ones that at least Native folks talk about as being kinship connected, right? Whether it's lodges or clans or families or other types of friendships. And so they're based on responsibilities. So a lot of people narrate seasonal time as a time where responsibilities are shifting throughout the year. You're coming into contact with different beings and entities and humans and others that you have different responsibilities to, but they're all working in a system and a web. And are obviously those responsibilities, like I was saying earlier, if they're kinship, they've got consent, self-determination, trust, reciprocity, and other things involved in them, right? And so actually you can tell time entirely through the transitions of trust and consent. You could actually think of something like consent as a relationship you have and should value with others, no matter the level of communication you have with them, as something itself is manifesting in different ways throughout the year. And it's connected to what you harvest, what you protect, what you eat, and so on. And so the idea then here is that if all these activities that are changing throughout the year are responsibility based and they're kinship, which means they're part of your overall community resilience, your overall community support network, then they actually help you to be responsive as a society to, again, the cues and changes that are happening around you. And so in that way, it's a way of recognizing that, yeah, there's certain cues that are happening in the seasons and so on throughout the year. But that when you practice the collective coordinative activities, they build, strength, and establish the kinship relations, which then contribute to your being more responsive, again, to the cues and changes, including the big disruptions. And this goes back to this point about the importance of, having high levels of trust or consent or reciprocity in the society, making it possible to be more responsive to mundane but severe disruptions as well. So all of that wisdom that Indigenous people have conveyed about seasonality goes way beyond just the idea that people know when this happens and when that happens. It's actually an entire philosophy of sustainability that values the importance of coordinated relationships. And that's why in Indigenous accounts of seasonal change, in some of the work that tribal colleges have done on seasonal rounds, but also, some of the work I've done with Samantha Chisholm Hatfield and others on Native ways of telling time, right? It actually suggests that when something is a little bit different from what might be considered to be typical during a year, that calls people to figure out and solve it together, right? It mobilizes them to solve the problem and to work together and to think about equity and justice. It's not just something that people react to and suspend the importance of kinship. It actually is a kinship response. And so anyways, so these are some ways of telling time. And like I said, there's others I've considered, but notice here that time is being told solely through kinship. And this is why for Native folks, I think climate change was never just something that was about the physical environment and how disruptive it could be, but because climate change was caused by violations of Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination in the form of land dispossession, which made it possible for the industries to grow that we now know are drivers of climate change, whether through deforestation, oil or gas or so on, right? Those were violations of kinship. And so the effects today are just a continuation of that. And will that carry forward into the solutions to climate change? I think it already is. And so it's time now to focus on the urgency of the social, the relational, the kinship tipping point, and that ought to be what motivates our action to lower the carbon footprint. Instead of looking at the justice aspects, right, the kinship aspects as restrictions or afterthoughts to the solutions to climate change. But anyways, that's what I wanted to start us off with, and looking forward to chatting and talking and discussing with everybody in what follows.
Thank you so much for that. All right, and for our next part of this, we're going to be doing our Q&A. for everyone we have here with us. For the next 15 minutes, we welcome questions from attendees before the Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace Committee join the panel for a discussion about the future of HSU's Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace. As a friendly reminder, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll also be live on Facebook where you can submit any questions in the comments. All right. So for our first question we have here, we have from Lonix Laundry. What do you say about to colleagues that shares they don't want to get caught up in the politics of social implications of our declining environment? They just want to conduct good science that can help inform solutions. And then also one that's very similar is from Sarah Ray, is I often hear the argument to my students or to others that the climate crisis is so urgent that there's no time to deal with racial justice or even Indigenous sovereignty. These same people are also hypercritical, likely to call that we need to return to Indigenous knowledges to fix climate problems. What do you say to people with within the climate movement who say that there is no time to deal with race, or that you can have social justice if you don't have a planet? And further, why do you think that the climate movement is divided between folks who are known to argue that the relationships are essential for climate resilience, and folks who think that the focus is a waste of time? So I guess really it's a question about the implications of race regarding climate justice and climate change, and how to really continue those conversations with people so polarized by those subjects.
Great. Yeah, good to get the questions. So, and I might ask you to quickly prompt me about some of the ones, Cody, that you mentioned a little bit later, but I think I'll remember them. So in terms of that first question about, I've done a lot of trainings for scientists, especially in climate science areas. And, a lot of it comes down to what stories that, that somebody really wants to be a part of. I think with the pandemic right now, with climate change, with a number of other issues, I'd be really curious for somebody to state, some example where there was a scientific solution that has actually been applied equally, and that everybody gets to partake in, and that, isn't associated with different forms of institutional power that have been exclusionary to different groups of people. And so I think it's somewhat horrifying when you think about how vulnerable some tribes and Native folks have been regarding the pandemic, to think that there is sort of such a thing as scientists just focusing on solutions, because it doesn't seem like, we've received all of the, all of the benefits of the solutions, even when they're just readily available for, for other folks. And, I think one really has to directly address the faulty assumptions of somebody who believes in such a thing as a focus on science, because what science are they referring to? And there's a paper I recently put online called Sciences of Consent, that does kind of address that type of concern, though. I mean, it doesn't say that directly, but it's focusing on this idea, right, that if you look at what currently passes for science, like say at the types of universities or other places that, that I've worked on, it doesn't actually live up to the standards of Indigenous science, right? So for example, there's no Indigenous science that would ever be accused of having an ivory tower. Well, why is that? Because Indigenous sciences exercised high quality peer review processes, right? Everybody knew what everybody is trained in. There's no esotericism. There are people that know more about particular things, but everybody knows where they got that training. And if their knowledge is to be credible, they have to get reviewed by all the different people in society that are going to be affected by that. And they have to hold themselves accountable to that, to those standards, right? There are implications for whether or not you're carrying out your duties as a knowledge holder. And so in Indigenous science, there's no separation between the practice of knowledge production and the practice of ensuring that knowledge matters, they're actually considered one and the same. So in that paper on sciences and consent, I argue that consent is not actually like a restriction on science. Like there's no such thing as, I produced the knowledge, now was it consensual, right? Nobody would have said that that horrible political regimes that tortured people, but that they produce great knowledge. Well, that's not knowledge at all if it was produced that way, right? And so this idea that you can still make knowledge even if it's done in bad and unethical ways is not an argument that I think a lot of Indigenous scientists accept, because any knowledge that is tied or tethered to relationships that harm us or are violent is certainly not knowledge that is serving society in any way. So I actually think that for a lot of Indigenous sciences, that if somebody says that, I just produced knowledge, it was applied inequitably, that wouldn't be knowledge, right? And that literally would not count as knowledge. If somebody they said, oh, I produced knowledge, but it was done in an ivory tower. Well, that's not knowledge if you haven't gotten criticism, feedback, and actual engagement with the people who will be affected most by the products of that knowledge. And so in that way, I understand not everybody's mind is going to be changed, right? But I think somebody that has that theory of science is just really tremendously misinformed and has a very ethnocentric conception of science. And I think their career would be a lot more exciting if they realized that that science was more than just trying to create a certain narrow conception of what a solution is, and was more engaged with the people who matter to that science. And it avoided kind of an ivory tower bench approach to science. Now in terms of the other question, I think I remembered it. So, I find the argument fairly, dubious that there's kind of like there needs to be a planet for there to be social justice. I think when somebody says that, it reveals where they're coming from. Yeah, right. Because if you look at like a lot of tribes in the US, and I know Indigenous people in other parts of the world who would attest to the same thing, like our ancestors literally saw, in some cases, well over 90% or more of the ecosystems they'd stewarded for generations just entirely disrupted. They were displaced, they were moved to Oklahoma, right? The land was shrunk. So if you look at where a lot of our more recent ancestors 100 years ago, or for some people less, or for some communities a little bit more, where they started from and the landscapes that they had to rebuild kinship within, I would actually argue that those landscapes were devastated in ways that are far worse than the imagination of some environmentalists who talk about, there not being a planet with because of climate change. If you want to know what it's like not having a planet, ask people that have been through genocide, what that means, right? And so to suggest that none of those things happen in the future, right, which is to make the argument that you can't have social justice without a planet, to make that argument, one is actually, disrespecting the histories that many people have went through, and the fact that the so-called world or planet today is not everybody's planet. It's one that was created by racial capitalism, by industrial society, and by different varieties of colonialism. And so in that way, the lessons that people should have learned is that if you want to save a planet, right, you have to build the kinship, which will make it possible for people not to exploit each other, for people not to be motivated to engage in dirty industries, and for actually people to have a shared sense of responsibility. And the non-social justice approach to climate change, look where it's gotten us. The international agreements and so on have moved too slowly. There's been conflict. The United States pulled out for some, under Trump from the Paris Accord, right? So that's an issue of kinship actually at the diplomatic level. And so in that way, I don't think the idea of urgency of just moving to save that which is held to be in peril is an adequate approach. And the last thing I'll just mention on that is the person who would say that there's no social justice without a planet. Look at all the other histories of colonialism where that type of thinking, not that topic, but that type of thinking was exactly in play, right?
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Kyle. Much to think about and reflect on. And we do have a lot of beautiful questions and mentions of gratitude in the commentary. We'd like to go ahead and put these two forward. Can you please tell the audience about the concept of collective continuance, and how does food sovereignty embody collective continuance, and how is this continuance impacted by climate change?
Great, and thanks for the question. So, in Indigenous studies, there's been a lot of powerful theories and philosophies about what it means to be a society that respects the idea that we're always in motion, and that fluidity is something that is more part of who we are than stability. And so, for Anishinaabe people, but I think also a lot of others, right? You get this tremendous capacity to have a dialogue on, the fundamental premise that we know everything is in flux around us, and we shouldn't deny that. We shouldn't try to control it or, tame it. But actually we should accept that. And that's actually part of accepting consent. When you accept that something, whether human, non-human, is always in motion around you, and you respect its own independence, you're engaging in a consent relationship, and you're having respect for that. And so collective continuance is an idea that, is built on, different Indigenous, thinkers, such as, the theories of survivance from Visner, but numerous others, right? It doesn't necessarily arise from one person in particular or one body of thought. And it's heavily tied to Anishinaabe traditions, but also other Indigenous traditions that I'm aware of. And so the way it kind of works, right, is that our societies, and all of us are part of more than one society at one time, right? But when we actually think about the societies in terms of the support networks that we're part of, right? Because for somebody to feel that they are, to use kind of an enlightenment term, right, to feel that they're free or they're independent, they can express who they are. You can't do that by yourself. You need a network of people who support you, who encourage you, right? And who actually take it as a responsibility that they respect your independence, they respect your freedom, and that the way in which we create societies that are most responsive to all the motion, including disruptions around us, is by building really rich networks of responsibilities. So I don't just have one responsibility, there are 2,000 responsibilities that I might have, and thousands of others that have responsibilities back to me. And so collective continuance is the idea that when we think about something like sustainability, or we think about something like resilience, that it's not just a technical or scientific measure. It's not like you're, resilient when you have enough wealth, or you have enough, political stability, or you're not sustainable. Sustainability is not just about carrying capacity, but actually you can understand those types of concepts through the quality of the responsibilities that you have to others. And that if you have a lot of responsibilities, if the responsibilities are honored throughout the year through ceremonies and practices, then you can actually measure something like sustainability or resilience solely through those responsibilities. And so this is why in Indigenous science and Indigenous scholarship, we can talk about climate change as an ethical issue, or food sovereignty as an ethical issue, because it's based on changes and transformations in degrees of responsibility. And so food, for example, is very important, and food sovereignty in this way is very important, because if you listen to folks who have talked about, devastations to their food systems, right, from a collective continuance perspective, what I would always notice is that when people talk about, say, the loss of a food, they don't talk about the loss of a food. They talk about changes in how they exercise their responsibilities. So that if, for example, somebody's land is shrunk to the point where it's harder to protect and harvest a certain food, the main thing is that they're not exercising the same responsibilities that they were before. And eventually they shift into a point in time where the responsibilities are no longer directed at that material food, but they're directed to the memory of that food. And then if there's further disruption, right, the responsibilities that people have to the memory of a food can actually become overwhelmed. And one of the ways to understand colonialism and how it affected food is that on the one hand, Indigenous people, many of them have very strong conceptions of responsibility, but an oppressing society can disrupt so quickly that it becomes very challenging to respond and to adapt and to renegotiate those responsibilities. And so collective continuance is the idea that responsibilities are escalating and de-escalating through the different disruptions we face. And when you face a society that's so toxic and unrelenting that they don't care what changes they impose on somebody else and how quickly they impose them, then it makes it challenging to continue certain responsibilities. And so this is why, if responsibility is actually where the locus of change is and not just in the actual materiality of the food, then kind of collective continuance suggests that food sovereignty is actually about restoring the responsibilities that are associated with food and not just the basic idea of the existence of the food itself, right? And I think this is an example between Indigenous food sovereignty and other forms of food sovereignty, where notice, like with other types of food sovereignty that a lot of non-Native people participated in, like labels and so on, that those labeling systems quickly got co-opted, right? The organic industry, an old colleague of mine at Michigan State, Phil Howard, has these studies that talk about the consolidation of organic and local food companies, right, to be taken over by corporations. So clearly that was a case where responsibility was not the focus of adaptation. Where notice a lot of Indigenous food sovereignty initiatives stay local. They can get bigger, they can scale up, but they stay local because the focus is on the responsibilities and restoring the responsibilities, and to do so in a way that's not going to be co-opted, and that regardless of what the future may hold, one is better off with stronger responsibilities, even at a small scale, than one is trying to scale up too quickly at the expense of taking responsibility seriously.
Thank you, Dr. Kyle.
Yeah.
Right. We have one last question before we go to our next Q&A panel with the Food Sovereignty Lab. I know you have done work with the Karuk tribe on the Climate Adaptations Plan. Could you speak briefly about your involvement with that project, and how does that project intersect with food sovereignty?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I've long been an admirer of the Karuk climate change work, and have served in different capacities as a reviewer of some of their planning documents and some of the publications and online activities they've done. And folks like Ron Reed from the tribe, but also some of their collaborators like Kari Norgard, and others I've maintained a really good dialogue with and cross-pollination. And when I've done climate change planning trainings for tribes, you and others, we've definitely looked to the Karuk climate change plan as one that's very inspiring. And yeah, just a few things about the Karuk approach. So one of the things that happened was that as different tribes moved into finding support from the federal government for their climate change planning, that oftentimes kind of the technical support that the United States would provide had like these kind of adaptation planning documents that were very technical. They were sort of like identify your vulnerabilities, identify your options to adapt, and come up with strategies for how you're going to prepare for climate change. And so they were kind of very bare bones, and kind of assumed that as Native people we didn't have our own theories and ideas about climate change. And so if you look at the different ways in which tribes have approached those templates for climate change plans, most tribes have not just kind of followed them, but have done their own thing. And what the Karuk tribe, really had an amazing, sovereignty-based approach. And, their online materials, I think, actually speak to that. I haven't looked at them in a while. But one of the things, right, that the Karuk tribe did that I think is important is that, it's not just about planning for climate change. It's about respecting the fact that Native people have their own knowledge of climate change, and Native people have their own capacity to engage in scientific research. And so if you notice in any of the Karuk climate change materials, they have a knowledge sovereignty plan that goes along with it. So it's a climate change plan, but to understand the climate change plan, you have to understand the knowledge sovereignty plan. The knowledge sovereignty plan is about building resilience and capacity within the Karuk tribe to steward its own trustworthy knowledge and use its own knowledge to prepare for climate change. And what's really interesting about that approach is it doesn't even stop there. That's just like the very tip, because the knowledge sovereignty is tied to education. It's tied to youth and elders. It's tied to mobilizing the society. And there's a heavy emphasis on the importance of food as something that can really energize people toward those kinship relationships. And so in the Karuk climate change materials, there is a lot where people in the tribe testify to how climate change and food affect them in different ways. And they don't stop at economic factors. They talk about spiritual factors, existential factors, but in a very practical way, they talk about how spirituality and existentiality is a cornerstone of political, social, cultural sovereignty. And so it's a plan and a program that I think has these really positive features, because it starts not only within Karuk philosophies and ways of being and ways of knowing, but has all these creative English language concepts like knowledge sovereignty, and it has a heavy food sovereignty component to it as well. And so I like that plan because it's a plan that's about mobilizing society. It's a plan that takes into account where their community, where their tribe is at, and really seeks to find ways to energize people to address climate change, and does challenge many of the fundamental assumptions of the US federal approach, and pushes the United States to not look at climate change as something that exists in a technical solution bubble and that can be solved through funding, but that requires much more understanding and care on the part of the United States as it begins to repair its diplomatic relationships with tribes. And that's another key aspect of the Karuk plan, is just the constant rejoinder about the fact that Karuk are self-determining, and that changes in respect for self-determination will automatically support improvements in preparedness for climate change.
Shikini, thank you so much. I'd just like to thank everyone for all their questions. We could not get to all of them as we did receive a lot, but also now we would like to take the time to thank our sponsor, the Natural History Museum, before we segue to our Food Sovereignty Lab panel.
As we transition from this wonderful Q&A, we'd like to first share a little bit about ourselves. This is going to be some information about the HSU Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace. The HSU Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace began as a student-led initiative during the fall of 2019 in a Native American Studies Indigenous Natural Resource Management class taught by Dr. Katja Riesling-Balde. Students were asked to create a class project that benefited the university, students, surrounding tribes, and the community. The class decidedly wanted to ask what improvements HSU could bring to better serve Indigenous students, the general student body, local tribes, and the community as a whole without well prioritizing Indigenous voices and needs. After conducting interviews with Indigenous students and staff, local tribal representatives, and Indigenous community members, students then coded responses and results to develop a proposal to address issues and concerns addressed by interviewees. The final proposal incorporated a multiple disciplinary approach to indigenizing Humboldt State University's campus. Our proposal of the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace incorporates the most common and pressing issues facing our Indigenous students and community. It is important to mention this research won second place in graduate level behavioral sciences at the CSU student-led research competition. The final proposal was brought to HSU and approved after tireless efforts of student activism and community and tribal support. A steering committee was then created to serve as the planning commission and governing body of the Food Sovereignty Lab. Cody and I will briefly introduce our committee members. Cody?
Thank you, Evie. I'd also like to remind anyone to looking into the history of the Food Sovereignty Lab. There's a really amazing video about the Food Sovereignty Lab's history and vision on the HSU NAS YouTube page. And I'm sure we'll throw a link there in the chat for you. But to briefly introduce our Food Sovereignty Lab, the committee is made up of tribal representatives, community organizations, students, grad students, faculty, and alumni, including the project director, Dr. Kutcha Riesling Baldley, tribal affiliations of Whye Valley Tribe in Yurok and Karuk. Kutcha Riesling Baldley is the department chair of the Native American Studies Department at Humboldt State University. Her work focuses on California Indians, decolonization, and social and environmental justice. The assistant director, Dr. Caitlin Reed, whose tribal affiliations are the Yurok tribe, Whye, and Oneida. Caitlin Reed is an assistant professor of Native American Studies at Humboldt State University. Her research is focused on tribal land and water rights, extractive capitalism, and settler colonial political economies. Jason Ramos, Blue Lake Rancheria Tribal Council, serves as the tribal council member for the Blue Lake Rancheria and chairman of the Blue Lake Rancheria Gaming Commission. Ramos works to advance tribal strategy, policy, programs, and investments in infrastructure and economic enterprise, and collaborates with tribes, federal, state, and local governments, and other agencies. Rachel Sundberg of Trinidad Rancheria and the Native Women's Collective, whose tribal affiliations are Coastal Yurok and an enrolled member of Trinidad Rancheria. Rachel Sundberg is a tribal programs director for the Trinidad Rancheria, where she manages and implements grants and cultural programming, cares for basket and regalia collection, and is responsible for the oversight and administration of multiple program areas for the tribe. Adam Cantler, a Whye tribal representative, and also Jen Slarich, a Bishop Paiute representative, are also on the committee.
We'd also like to introduce Louisa McCovey. Louisa is the director of the Yurok Tribe Environmental Program. She will be representing the Food Sovereignty Division of the Yurok Tribe Environmental Program. They are currently working on projects regarding tan oak groves and huckleberries. Also, Taylor Thompson, two-spirited citizen of the Cherokee Nation, Food Sovereignty Division Manager for the Yurok Tribe, and new member of the HSU Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace Steering Committee. There's also Jude Marshall, working with United Indian Health Service Community Food Garden. Tribal affiliation is Whye Valley Tribe. Jude Marshall is the Community Nutrition Program Manager at United Indian Health Service, Potawat Health Village in Arcata, California. He oversees the thriving Potawat Community Food Garden, which supplies healthy nutrition to many Native families through the integration of nutrition education within a variety of settings, including home, schools, community groups, and events. Dr. Sarah Ray is the Department Chair of Environmental Studies at Humboldt State University. Dr. Sarah Ray is a professor and program leader for the Environmental Studies Bachelor's Program at HSU. She did her PhD in Environmental Science, Studies, and Policy at University of Oregon and was a professor of English and program leader of the Geography and Environmental Studies Bachelor's Program at University of Alaska Southeast prior to coming to HSU. The students represented on our committee are the following. Moxie Alvarez, graduate student in the Environment and Community Program at HSU, tribal affiliation Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiian. We also have Morlana Dusek, graduate student in the Environment and Community Program at HSU, and tribal affiliation Kumye, Paiomakowicham, and Kuapangawish. Also Kim Negus, graduate student at HSU, and her tribal affiliation is Colwitz Tribe. We also have Carrie Tolley, graduate student, Environment and Community at HSU.
At this time, we welcome questions and comments from attendees, but this time will be reserved for the steering committee members to ask questions. Everyone is welcome to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will also be live on Facebook where you can submit questions in the comments. We will now open the discussion and questions. Please introduce yourself and briefly share the type of work you do. And really anyone can take it away at this point.
And hey, folks, if there's anybody in the steering committee that is still sitting in the attendees column, shoot me a message really quick, and I'll make sure you get carried over here.
I wanted to start. So I'm Dr. Kutcher Risling-Baldy. I am Hupa Yerkin Karuk and the Department Chair of Native American Studies here at Humboldt State University. And I just wanted to thank Dr. Whye for joining us today and being so open to having this discussion and conversation on top of doing a presentation, and especially during this time, which I like to really acknowledge, like we're coming together during a time when I think there's always a sense of urgency around everything that we do, but right now, especially, I think we all feel like there is a real sense of urgency about why it's so important to maintain our community connections, especially across time, space, distance, and all the things that are kind of keeping us from being able to build relationships, I think, in the ways that we normally would with each other. And I'm fortunate enough to think about how you've done work with people in this region before, so I'm sure you're used to us and like how we are and everything, but I miss that we haven't been able to build a connection with you that allows you to kind of know our rivers and our waters and our fish and all the things that we would normally do, just to show like the ways in which we're thinking about this. And I truly admire the students who have been doing this work for the last over a year now. That started in one of my classes, but has really grown from there. And I think that one thing that I've noticed about them as students on this campus is they see food sovereignty as so important to what our futures are going to be. And like when we think about the work that an educational, like a higher institution, like an educational institution is supposed to be doing, the students are always saying that we should be supporting Indigenous food sovereignty, that is going to be the thing that kind of supports all of us and what this world is supposed to look like. And I'm wondering for you, Dr. Whye, what does your work look like when there are people who are wondering sort of why Indigenous food sovereignty? Like why this direction? And what we came up against in our own spaces with the people that we're working with here is a lot of like, well, how is this for everyone, right? Like we see this as very particular to a particular group of people, but and so what do you tell people when you start saying like, this is why food sovereignty, this is why we're moving in this direction, this is why this can be important for everyone?
Great, thanks for your question. I appreciate your remarks, Professor Risling-Baldy. Yeah, and I agree. I mean, it's I have, in doing the Zoom events, noticed some of the differences between being able to make more meaningful connections that are place-based. And so it's great to, to hear you, acknowledge that and the importance of that aspect of connectivity. But, just listening to folks, bios and the work that they're doing and so on, it gives a sense of the importance and the power of place and the work that they're doing. And so I was really excited to hear about the folks on the steering committee for this project. And, in response to the question that you brought up, it actually brought up something that kind of earlier in my career happened that kind of sent me down some directions in terms of some of the early writings I was part of on food sovereignty. So I remember, because I used to work at a big, land grant university, and somebody early on had made kind of a snide comment to me about, like, well, they were familiar with a couple of Indigenous food sovereignty initiatives, like, I don't know, saying like wild rice. And they noted that, those initiatives had like no possible hope of actually like creating enough food to solve, hunger and nutrition issues, or, those initiatives, were just like restoring like one food when actually there would be like hundreds and so on of foods. And so they kind of tried to diminish Indigenous food sovereignty. And so, I don't like to do stuff out of like spite, or out of like a grudge or anything like that. But I admit some of the stuff I did subsequently was, kind of based on that resentment of that point. And, so some of the writings I did on sturgeon restoration with Jimmy Mitchell and Stephanie Ogren and Marty Holtgren, which are available online. It's called Renewing Relatives, and I've written about it, was trying to actually address this program. And so it had to do with Anishinaabe sturgeon restoration. And, in the Great Lakes, Anishinaabe, Menominee, other people have been involved in the restoration of sturgeon. And what for me was particularly powerful about it is that, so first of all, given how sturgeon populations in some regions have been very, very devastated, that to restore sturgeon, you can't just do it in a few years. In fact, to get a population of sturgeon that you could, engage in a nutritional exchange sense, right, might even take like 100 years. And so, what was important there is that there was something so important about sturgeon and its relationship as a first food that it was so important to rekindle, even if you couldn't immediately eat the fish. And so, what was that saying? Well, if you look at a lot of the initiatives, like the one that I wrote about with my colleagues, who are the actual people that did it at the Little River Band of Odawa Indians, is that actually when they began to restore sturgeon, it was way more than just about the sturgeon. It was about the kinship that the sturgeon brought. So just to mention a couple features of that work, when they figured out what it would mean to restore sturgeon in that area, they actually had to figure out some innovative scientific approaches because the environment had changed so much that it would be hard for the sturgeon to survive, and sturgeon are anadromous. And so the tribe actually had to come together and work with elders, with the state, with others to develop a scientific solution to restoring sturgeon. They actually did develop an innovation where they were able to protect the sturgeon in these tanks and pump the river water in from the native streams, right? So they would create that capacity for the anadromousness, so they would have that memory of those original waters. And what's interesting about that is at least at the time, the connection scientifically wasn't fully known. So it was actually an experiment that this would work. And that's what was interesting as well. It was actually an experiment. But part of this sturgeon restoration. So then when they started actually doing the restoration, they actually had a ceremony. And what was interesting about the ceremony is, like, a lot of parts of Indian country are hostile areas. I mean, there's a lot of racists and, other folks out there. And there were challenges and conflicts about the relation between the tribes and others. But shoot, people get excited and come together around tiny sturgeon that you could have in a bucket and release into the river. And it was so exciting that their sturgeon ceremony, where they would take the sturgeon that were big enough to be released into the river, and there were hundreds of sturgeon that you could release, would bring together hundreds of people from all over the community. And if you were to go to that event, and some of the times I went to it, you would hear people actually talking about issues of like colonialism and power and oppression and environmental destruction that would have been very hard for them to talk about apart from the sturgeon. And it actually, I wish there was a way to kind of fully study these things, but I think for people that live there, they can attest to it well enough, that there was a lot of healing that takes place in the sturgeon ceremonies and activities that, and in one of the papers, we actually wrote that actually, because of the sturgeon restoration process, a lot of the scientists and others in the tribes noticed that they were getting more respect as sovereigns because people learned more about the tribe through their experience with the sturgeon. And so the idea was that you take something like sturgeon as a food sovereignty initiative. You can't eat it in 100 years, right? It provides actually a vehicle for people to talk about history, to talk about tribal culture, to talk about repairing conflict, to talk about political sovereignty. And so just that little fish, which obviously, as we know, gets to be a pretty large fish, but still just that fish alone held a power that other mechanisms didn't hold, right? I mean, people for years have been trying to have conversations, get people at the table. That wasn't working. But with sturgeon, it can work, right? And so these first foods, these particular relatives, they have a certain power to them that extends beyond a measure like nutrition. And so going back to this point of kinship, if a first food can capture the attention and the attentiveness of the non-native population and other people who share a region together. And that can get them talking about things and talk about repairing relationships and the importance of tribal sovereignty. Then that improved connectivity and relationality is going to have a much more sweeping effect in other food initiatives and other areas in the future. And so for that reason, right, Indigenous food sovereignty, it's impossible to avoid linking it to all these other areas. So if somebody wants to improve the capacity of the people in the locality to organize to make change, well, what's a more powerful way to get people to organize than to center it around food? And to center it around native foods. I mean, literally that can crystallize a movement. And you can apply that to education. Imagine if our classroom experiences were actually tied to seasonal food activities, we're outdoors and so on. Well, that would be way better. I mean, most of these colleges with the classroom set up, I mean, as faculty, they do their best to work with that, you know, but that's not exciting, and it's really hard to prepare people for what happens afterwards. And so in that way, I think that, you know, the sovereignty part of food sovereignty is really important. And, you know, I do think there are certain industrial foods that they don't hold that promise, and the rejection of industrial foods does not hold that promise. But our first foods, you know, they really do. And the last thing I'll just mention is with, you know, other communities, right, with, you know, colleagues who are African American or from other diasporic populations, you know, they have also recognized the power of their traditions of seeds and food and so on for their activism. And in some cases, right, like with Black agrarianism, you know, they've overcome years of harmful feelings about agriculture and so on, because they also have their own independent traditions of foods and gardens and farming and so on that are tied to their self-determination and their continuance. So, you know, it's not just us as Native people, there's other communities that they've been onto this as well for some time. Anyways, thanks for your good question.
I'd like to briefly interject. Thank you, Dr. Kyle, for the answer. We also want to recognize that Dr. Penelise Droz from Indian Collective is a member on our committee.
Oh.
And, so Dr. Penelise Droz is the member of 5 children and a program officer at Indian Collective, working to support the defense, regenerative development, and decolonization of our Indigenous nations. And she is the tribal affiliation Anishinaabe. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to hear your kind of thoughts on kind of possible sites of integration between like first foods and like ideally not like industrial foods, but non-traditional foods. And so our food sovereignty lab is also working with numerous tribal partners. And so the Yurok Tribe Environmental Program just recently launched the Food Sovereignty Division. And so like they are just now getting started, and they couldn't be here with us today. And so they had some questions they really wanted to make sure that we asked you. And so part of the work, and so while we want to do kind of education and outreach here on campus, right, we also want to support the work of like ongoing and already existing food sovereignty projects. And so they are currently working on restoring access to traditional foods with high priorities on tan oak groves, and to kind of reflect the traditional state of like our 3 sisters, tan oak mushrooms, and huckleberries. And so those are some of the foods that they're currently working on restoring right now. But there's a question for you about, can you offer your thoughts on adding non-traditional foods into sovereign food systems in response to a lack of availability of traditional foods, specifically because of climate change, right? And like decline in access or quality of foods or contamination of foods, or whatever, for whatever reason they're unavailable. And so she's thinking specifically about like sources of protein, right? And so in their tribal communities, wildlife, marine, and river species are like prime sources of protein that like are declining rapidly, right? And so they'd like your thoughts on kind of how do we address like the lack of ability of traditional foods in restoring our food systems, but also like being cognizant that there are like nutritional needs, and like that we may need to kind of supplement those, right? And so how do we approach that in ethical ways? Like, and for example, they ask, do you think it's better to prioritize plant-based proteins to cover nutritional needs between access to traditional animal products, to cultivate livestock? Like, what are your thoughts on like, how do we kind of, I guess not dive into industrial foods, but how do you suggest we use them when needed? So I hope that question coming from the Yurok tribe, food sovereignty division, was clear. I'm sure they would have asked it more eloquently, but.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. And yeah, so I've thought a lot about that that issue, and this is the approach, and it's actually I've had a lot of sources of this that, kind of going way back to conversations even with different Indigenous chefs and kind of others about this. And I think there's a lot that tribes can do, but there's a lot of philosophy that that kind of goes into this actually. And I'd be really curious about how some tribes would sort of organize this, right? So for example, there's kind of the stereotype out there, right, is that if you do first foods work, it means that you're sort of somebody that's obsessed with trying to replicate some historical way of like harvesting or protecting food or storing food that was practiced at time T. And well, when is time T? It depends on the community, right? But it could be some point where different sources of information would locate a particular practice, and you do your best to reconstruct it from there. And that's one aspect of food sovereignty, right? So that's one part of it. And I think it's important to be clear that in communities where we need more varieties of food, we need a lot more nutritious food, and we need a lot more explicit discussion about where our food comes from, that actually a subset of activities that we do where we're trying to replicate time T is very valuable, right? And but we need to understand the place for that. So for example, I think that activities that engage with a very small amount of food that might be possible using a very traditional way of protecting and harvesting food, that can be amazing for youth education. That can be amazing for certain holidays and other types of tribal activities, right? Like tribal holidays, ceremonies, and so on. That's very important and can have all of these ramifications. But that's just one part, right? There's other parts of food sovereignty that expand across the food system, right? So one part, right, and again, this is where a tribe can do all sorts of really interesting and creative roles, right? So another aspect could be you take the exact same food. Is there another way to cultivate it? And is there a way to cultivate it ethically, right? And that can be really interesting about if you take tribal values and think about that exact food, and what are the techniques, the new techniques that would be used? And do those new techniques, what other benefits do they provide? Do they provide a way for a tribe to to create more scientific and educational opportunities? Do they provide a chance for there to be more availability of food for ceremonies and other practices that are being rekindled, right? Okay, so that's one approach to it. But there's other layers too. So what about a layer where you are not cultivating any food that could be tied to like a traditional food, but you're doing it in a way that reflects, certain tribal values. And I think that some of the tribal values that can be tied to working with other types of foods are ones that oftentimes actually aren't discussed as tribal values. So, for example, when I think about tribal values of food historically, I actually think about the food system. So in a tribal food system, what are some differences between that system and the current food system? Well, in the current food system, even somebody like many of us here that are thinking a lot about food and learn a lot about food, we still don't know where the majority of the food comes from. We don't know what technologies are used. We don't know who's involved in it. We have no idea. And that information is hard to find. But in our food systems, the kinship was so strong, and the education and training was that people were very well acquainted about where food came from, but also about where energy came from, and so it doesn't mean that that was just a function of their locality. It wasn't just a function of their locality. We know our ancestors were quite scaled up, right? The idea that we were just these local kind of entities is not true. We were scaled up through vast kinship networks that took generations to develop, and that kinship created a flow of information, which created a great deal of awareness and understanding of where food came from. And so the idea of the importance of knowing where food comes from is actually a tribal value, and that can be created in contexts that are involving different foods that tribes have as part of their variety or their biodiversity of foods, which could include different types of quote unquote industrial processes, but are modified to reflect those values, right? I mean, if you're going to launch a larger scale food operation, like a larger commercial agricultural operation, can you do so in a way that doesn't exclude the knowledge of how to operate that agricultural enterprise in ways that I think I just said exclude, but that exclude everybody else in the tribe, right? Could it actually be something where everybody understands it, learns how it works, different people are participating in it, which also means people have the capacity to critique it and to push for change. And so in this way, right, if you actually think, in my view, if we think at several layers of what the tribal values are, we find that there's these various features like knowing where your food comes from, that actually can really be transformative of how we approach other foods. And so again, for different tribes, you can completely map out, like, I don't know, 20 different dimensions of the food sovereignty program applied to a whole bunch of different foods. And I don't think I've seen that many tribes who have at least publicly done something like this. I've seen a lot of really good tribal food sovereignty plans that were able to do it with some foods, but I think there's a lot more that can be done. And so I don't know what you would call that type of planning, but it's one that I think can be really kind of inspiring for especially a lot of younger people, because I think for some of us, we look to people who are sort of replicating historical approaches, and you can have kind of a ambivalent relation to that, right? I mean, maybe you don't have access or capacity, or maybe really, like with that point about climate change, it might be diminishing so much that clearly not everybody can participate in it, right? So what's left for people that don't have the privilege to engage in some of those practices? And there has to be alternatives where we can express the very same types of values and receive the very same types of benefits. And I think in some of the conversations I've had with Indigenous chefs, that's one of the things they focused on, is, right, the idea that being an Indigenous chef is about replicating historic forms of, food production and cultivation would mean there probably wouldn't be any, native restaurants, right? But it's really about those principles, those core teachings about how you prepare any food, including the ethics of where the food comes from. And this is a lesson we see with climate change, right? Should tribes invest in solar if the materials for solar are procured in unethical ways, right? So there's things like that that are really important, and I'd like to see more tribes really develop out those different layers so that you understand exactly the different roles and purposes of these different understandings of food sovereignty, including the diplomatic aspects of it, right? Because food sovereignty got a bad name because it was tied historically to countries that wanted to just have like a self-contained food system, like the United States, where it provides the subsidies, export stuff to other countries to create interdependent, right, problematic forms of dependence. And so in this way, right, food sovereignty is also about the diplomatic aspects of it as well, which should be built into a food sovereignty plan. What's the food sovereignty committee or department? How are they going to participate in tribal diplomatic affairs and advise on those tribal diplomatic affairs? But anyways, I could just keep like, spinning this, but I'm encouraged to hear about the work of the new department, new, but also old, of course, right? So yeah, great.
Thank you. You reminded me of something Megan Baldy said. She runs the Eating Healthy in Indian Country YouTube channel, and she was like, if hoopas had kale, they'd be growing miles and miles and miles of it. And so, yeah, I like thinking about like ethical cultivation. But I think here in California, right, then that begs the question of water use and water infrastructure, and could open up a whole other set of conversations. I want to be cognizant of your time because we asked you to hang out with us until 4. I wanted to offer up on the table, is there any pressing concerns any members of our steering committee want to make sure they express or ask Dr. Whyte before we all head into our late afternoons for today?
Well, I did want to say, again, thank you so much for coming, but I just was wondering if when you hear that the HSU students are interested in doing this food sovereignty lab and cultural workshop space and some of the things that they've described about it and what they're thinking about, and they really did this with community involvement and getting the community to give them feedback about what that could be, are there any like particular visions or things that you would want us to consider or think about, or things that you get excited about when you hear that students are helping us to move in this direction here at HSU?
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. And based on what I've learned, I'm not surprised to hear that at all. I mean, it's interesting that when I was able to visit campuses and like spend like a couple days just connecting with people where they had like amazing Native sovereignty supporting programs, I'd always find out. I typically find out a similar story, right? Which is that the tenure system faculty who are part of that program, they came later, right? It was community members, students, people that were part-time lecturers and others that actually created the program, and that the further funding opportunities came later. And I think that's important. What inspires me is that I'd like to see a way of cultivating the space of the program, including its marketing and materials, that continues to hold that history and that early work. And I know they're probably at Humboldt State or Terrence and faculty part of those early stages, but I was just using maybe an extreme example to illustrate a point, right? That kind of equality in the presentation of the origin story of the program is huge. And I think actually one of the things that programs, as they move on, that they begin to miss is the importance of that origin story, and to constantly revisit it and expand it and grow it. We talk so much in our tribal communities about the importance of origin stories, but they're important in all facets, right? And so that's uplifting for me to hear about that work. Another thing about the program where I think that, I've already been, engaging in this with you all, but the idea of really changing how we talk about outcomes, and to really focus on ways on representing outcomes that show that relationship building and the power of that relationship building and that kinship building. Because again, this cuts against the grain of that approach, where because certain numerical types of outcomes are not witnessed, that people miss the growth of kinship and the amount of effort that it takes to work out the basic development of kinship relationships, which could have lasting effects. And to actually see materials and so on that actually reflect that kinship and the time that it took to make those early relationships, it could really be transformational. Because I think about like what I was missing in my educational situation, and when I was in different schooling systems, I wasn't taught that kinship was important and was valuable. I was taught that like your publications or your grades or things like that were what were, important. And, shoot, my grades, haven't meant anything to me at all moving forward. Which is good because I never really got very good grades anyways, but still, right? I mean, and I think that's important about the program is how do you witness to kinship, and how do you continue to do that in ways that retell, revisit, and restore that origin story of the program. And it sounds like, given what you all have shared, that type of thing, if you choose it, or you've already chosen it, or you've got all sorts of other ideas, is totally possible, right? So, all right. Well, thanks for giving me a chance to share a bit further.
We're about to wrap everything up. We do want to thank Dr. Kyle Whye for joining us today, and for all the panelists that were able to also come on and provide questions beforehand and during. Before we depart, would you like to give us any final statements or reiterate any thoughts, panelists or Dr. Whye? All right, silence is golden. Please thank you, attendees, for being here with us today, providing your comments, your thoughts, your questions, your presence. Also, we want to encourage you to catch up with our Native American Heritage Month Food Sovereignty Speakers Series and learn more about the HSU Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace. We'd also like to say that to view the first session about our emerging HSU Food Sovereignty Lab and Cultural Workspace, History and Vision, you can visit the Humboldt State University Native American Studies Facebook page. We also have an awesome YouTube channel. View the session at the HSU YouTube channel, and you can view all the other recorded sessions and all of our activism, as well as all the panelists here who have contributed a great deal to this lab and all the other work that we focus on. So I'm sure those links will be provided. We'd also like to recognize that our time and efforts are straight from our heart, and this collaboration means a lot to us. We'd also appreciate it if you have time to donate to our Food Sovereignty Lab so that we can make our vision a reality. And we have a little link in the chat, I think, for everybody. We know that sometimes $1 is all that's possible, and we really are just looking to see how many people are interested in supporting, and we also appreciate feedback. So thank you for your time in doing that. We'd also like to go ahead and let you know that this is one of the first speakers panels, and we'll have more in the future coming up. And as you know, everything has been recorded today, so we'll do our best to follow up with any questions that we couldn't get to today. But thank you again for joining us. It was an honor.